Last time we spoke about the battle for South Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. In August of 1945, as Japan teetered on the edge of destruction, following the atomic bombings, a desperate situation unfolded. The Soviet Union launched a sudden invasion of Manchuria, catching the Japanese off guard. On August 14th, Japan's decision to surrender was made, announced to the world the following day. However, the Kwangtung Army resisted fiercely, engaging in frantic evacuations. In South Sakhalin, Japanese defenders clashed with the advancing Soviet troops, facing overwhelming odds. By August 18th, chaos reigned on the Japanese side, with forces surrendering and civilians in panic. As the Soviets pushed forward, the situation became increasingly dire for Japan. Despite valiant resistance, the imminent defeat had become clear. In a moment of a critical decision, Emperor Hirohito accepted the terms of surrender, officially sealing Japan's fate and marking the end of the Pacific War. However, the Soviets had not yet stopped their onslaught. This episode is Soviet Victory in Asia. Welcome back to the Pacific War podcast week by week. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just wanted to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I released a rather wacky episode covering the Fukuryu, Japan's kamikaze frogmen. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. At last, we are drawing near to the real conclusion of the Pacific War. Japan had officially surrendered. However, the Soviets were not done just yet. East Asia is a delicious piece of cake, laid wide open, and Stalin intended to take every piece he could before the curtains fall. Now, as we last left off on August 18th, General Yamada's Kwangtung Army had surrendered to Soviet forces led by Marshal Vasilevsky, who was advancing rapidly through Manchuria. Yet some Japanese units, like those at Khalkhin, continued to resist occupation until the month's end. On August 19th, following Yamada's announcement that all military operations had ceased, a Soviet delegation had arrived at Xinqing. A daring operation then took place, where a 225-strong detachment from the 6th Guards Motorized Rifle Brigade, part of the 5th Guards Tank Corps, was airlifted to the city's main airfield. This mission, along with others, was carried out under Marshal Vasilevsky on August 18th. And this was following the commander's initial offer of surrender from the Kwangtung Army. Vasilevsky's directive was urgent. The Japanese resistance is broken, and the challenging road conditions hinder the swift advance of our main forces. We need to deploy specially formed, fast-moving, and well-equipped units to capture Changchun, Mukden, Jilin, and Harbin immediately. These units should remain flexible for future missions, regardless of their distance from the main forces. The push to accelerate operations came directly from Joseph Stalin himself. From Kulychkin's biography on Marshal Vasilevsky, he recounts a pivotal phone call he received on August 15th. Stalin was informed that the Japanese had, quote, lost command and control, and that they were unable to mount a strong defense, with their forces divided into several fragmented groups. Vasilevsky confidently stated, even a miracle cannot save the Japanese from total defeat. He further stressed the need to maintain the momentum of the offensive. Stalin's response was quite straightforward. Good. We need to increase the pace. What proposals do you have? Vasilevsky revealed plans to use airborne assault forces against larger cities like Harbin, Changchun, Jilin, and Mukden, alongside advanced mobile units across all combined arms armies. These units, consisting of tanks and assault guns, would be fully equipped with desanniki ready to engage firmly in the ongoing operations. Now the landing at Shenyang, that being Mukden, revealed a remarkable twist of fate. Waiting at the airfield for evacuation to Japan was none other than the recently abdicated Emperor Puyi of Manchukuo. On August 15th of 1945, Puyi turned on his radio and he listened to Emperor Hirohito's address announcing Japan's surrender. In this historic speech, the Showa Emperor referred to America's use of the most unusual and cruel bomb, which had just devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For Puyi, this was the first revelation of the atomic bombings, information that the Japanese had conveniently withheld from him until that moment. The aircraft carrying Major Chelchev's force, escorted by fighter planes, landed at 1:15 p.m. without any opposition, and they captured him. This small unit's survival hinged on remaining unchallenged, and they successfully secured the airfield. They also freed several Allied personnel held at the nearby Houghton prisoner war camp. As soon as the landing was secured, additional reinforcements were airlifted later that day, led by General Kravchenko, the commander of the 6th Guards Tank Army. He formally accepted the city's surrender, as the Soviets then transported Puyi to the Siberian town of Chita. Meanwhile, Vasilevsky's ground offensive pressed on, mostly unopposed, though some resistance persisted. In the Transbaikal front, Marshal Malinovsky's General Pliyev led his cavalry mechanized units against the Japanese forces around Kalgan. Other units reached Johol and accepted the surrender of the 108th Division. General Danilov's 17th Army secured the Shanhaiguan coast, while General Managrov's 53rd Army pushed towards Kailu. The main force of General Kravchenko's 6th Guards Tank Army regrouped at Tongliao and Kaitong, prepared to advance south towards Mukden. General Lidnikov's 39th Army steadily approached Changchun, confronting the bypassed 107th Division, and General Luchinsky's 36th Army occupied Tsitsikhar, accepting the surrender of the 136th Independent Mixed Brigade. At the same time, on General Podkayev's 2nd Far Eastern Front, General Turyokin's 2nd Red Banner Army continued its siege of Akhun's fortified region. Meanwhile, a 4th detachment moved slowly south through the Lesser Kagan mountain range. General Mamanov's 15th Army began capturing and processing prisoners from the many retreating Japanese units after a successful amphibious assault secured Sansing. The Amur River Flotilla supported the army's push towards Harbin, while General Pashkov's 5th Rifle Corps finally reached Poli, which had already been occupied by other Soviet units. In Marshal Meletskov's 1st Far Eastern Front, 4 detachments of General Zakvaitayev's 35th Army began arriving at Linkou, focusing on the surrender of Japanese units in that area. Rear elements effectively eliminated the last traces of enemy resistance in the Hotel fortified area. After a challenging struggle through the wetlands and the capture of Mishan on August 12th, advanced detachments of the 35th Army's main force, those being the 66th and 363rd Rifle Divisions, continued their advance against minimal opposition. The situation was starkly different to the rear, where the 105th Rifle Regiment of the 264th Rifle Division, supported by the heavily reinforced 109th Fortified Region, worked to dismantle the now isolated Huatal fortified area. Despite the dire circumstances, the garrison refused to surrender. Thus, the focus shifted to systematically eliminating their defenses, which became a painstaking task. The attackers deployed an artillery destruction group, securing air supremacy and utilized well-trained assault formations. Their techniques included pouring kerosene or gasoline into ventilation shafts of underground structures, sometimes in alarming quantities. For instance, 2 tons of gasoline were recorded being poured into a single installation before ignition was applied. Despite the brutal and methodical obliteration of these positions, the defenders continued to ignore orders to surrender. Notably, on August 18th, a Japanese prisoner was sent under a flag of truce to inform those still holding out that the war was officially over. Tragically, he was hacked to death by a sword-wielding Japanese officer. Ultimately, this stubbornness led to catastrophic consequences. About 3,000 defenders were killed, blasted, and burned before a small number finally capitulated. Additionally, advanced detachments of General Beloborodov's 1st Red Banner Army reached Shangchu before continuing towards Harbin, and 4 elements of General Krylov's 5th Army pushed on towards Jilin. General Kristakov's 25th Army commenced disarming General Murakami's 3rd Army, while the 10th Mechanized Corps advanced rapidly westwards, crossing the Laolin mountain passes to arrive at Tonghua by nightfall. Over in North Korea, the 335th Rifle Division successfully landed at Chongjin as General Kabanov's Southern Defense Region prepared for an assault on Gensan. In South Sakhalin, despite the surrender of the 125th Regiment and ongoing negotiations with General Mineki's 88th Division, Soviet forces opted to proceed with the planned landing at Mayoka. Consequently, Admiral Andreyev's Northern Pacific Flotilla departed from Sovetskaya Gavan in the morning, carrying the bulk of the 113th Rifle Brigade, along with a battalion of Marines, for the long and challenging voyage to Majorca. Over on Shamshu Island, as General Gineko's forces were landing their artillery to renew their assault, Japanese officers unexpectedly approached the Soviets under flags of truce, carrying a letter from General Tsutsumi proposing negotiations for surrender. Representatives from both sides began discussions, and by 6 p.m., the 91st Division formally surrendered the garrisons of Shamshu, Parameshur, and Onukatan. On August 20th, Ginechko dispatched a small detachment of 6 vessels to seize control of the airfield at Kataoka. However, as they crossed the second Kuril Strait, batteries on both sides of the narrow waterway opened heavy fire on the Soviet ships, forcing them to withdraw. This breach of the surrender agreement sparked a renewed offensive at 1 p.m., coordinated with many airstrikes. The bases at Kataoka and Kashawabar were bombed by 61 aircraft, which dropped over 200 bombs, enabling ground troops to push forward up to 6 kilometers. It was not until General Tsutsumi intervened that the Soviets were assured that the Japanese would indeed lay down their arms. Meanwhile, Andreyev's convoy arrived in Majorca harbor on the morning of August 20th, successfully landing the first wave of Marines amidst some heavy fog. They quickly spread out and secured the area, while the second and third waves of infantry followed behind. By noon, the port area was secured and the Marines began advancing eastwards into the city, supported by infantry on their flanks. Taken by complete surprise, the Japanese defenders were ultimately compelled to retreat, with the 113th Rifle Brigade pursuing them through the mountains to the villages of Futamata and Osaka. Back in Manchuria, between August 20th and the 21st, Vasilevsky's units continued their advance to occupy the region's main centers. Stalin had urged for even greater speed, fearing that any delay might prompt President Truman to order General MacArthur's air-naval assault forces to land there. Notably, Pliev's first column successfully captured Kalgan, while his second column moved south towards Beijing, while also securing Gubeikou on the border. Located in one of the passes through the Great Wall, marking the border between Manchukuo and China, the town of Gubeikou was garrisoned by many Japanese units. These forces surrendered upon the approach of the Soviet troops, who then quickly advanced towards Beijing, about 100 kilometers away. Although not the former capital itself, this area was under the control of the Chinese Communist forces known as the Eighth Route Army, who had then aligned with the Soviets. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek was acutely aware that any Japanese capitulation to the Communists in northern China would allow the latter to occupy vital territories, making their removal quite difficult. Consequently, he commanded the Eighth Route Army not to accept any Japanese surrenders, insisting they only surrender to the nationalist forces, with dire punishments threatened for defiance. Now, adding to the complexity, the Soviet Union and China had signed the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship and Alliance, discussed at the Yalta Conference just 6 days earlier, that being August 14th. This treaty promised mutual respect for sovereignty and non-interference in each other's internal affairs. The Soviets had also committed to providing moral support and aid in military supplies and other material resources exclusively to the nationalist government as the legitimate center of authority in China. Thus, a significant political and military predicament loomed. However, the Soviets quickly extricated themselves from the situation when Malinovsky issued an order forbidding Pliev's forces from crossing the border. As Pliev recounted, his formations were poised just halfway between Chengdu and Beijing, needing only one leap to take the Chinese capital. As he noted, "I had to suspend the offensive and move north beyond the Great Wall." Meanwhile, units from the 6th Guards Tank Army occupied both Changchun and Mukden, initiating a rail movement towards Port Arthur and Dairen. For those curious, at Pingfan and Changchun, one General Shiro Ishii and the remaining personnel from Units 731 and 100 were captured by the Soviet forces. In a tragic turn of events, all of their test subjects were murdered and cremated, while the Japanese busily attempted to destroy any evidence of their facilities and what they were doing there, but they were unable to do so in time. Following their capture, the Soviets launched an extensive campaign to uncover the secrets behind Units 731 and 100, leading to what was known as the Khabarovsk trial. It's an extremely dark part of history. I like to call it Japan's Operation Paperclip. And it just so happens I wrote extensively on this subject, the secret dealings between Unit 731 and the Allies after World War II. It's over on my Patreon account or my YouTube membership, titled The Secrets of Unit 731. I have to say, it's some pretty disgusting stuff, and a lot of big disclaimers before venturing into that. The Soviets then arrived at Dairen on August 24th, although these places had already surrendered to air and land forces about 2 days earlier. There was no doubt much to the relief of Joseph Stalin, as these were amongst the main locations where he most feared American intervention. Indeed, on the day of the landing, he had told Vasilevsky to keep in mind that any delay could mean Truman will order General MacArthur to land his naval assault forces there. The long-resisting 135th Independent Mixed Brigade finally surrendered at Aachen, while advance units of the 2nd Red Banner Army secured Nanchang and Pian before pushing towards Qiqihar and Harbin. 4 detachments from the 15th and 1st Red Banner Armies also reached the already occupied parts of Harbin. Furthermore, advance units of the 5th and 25th Armies arrived in Jilin to reinforce the air-landed detachments there. Additional units from the 88th Rifle Corps and the 10th Mechanized Corps began their southward movement into Korea, heading towards the 38th parallel. In North Korea, Kabanov dispatched a Marine battalion and other units totaling some 2,000 men to occupy the fortified port of Gensan on August 20th. The following morning, the landing force arrived and disembarked without any opposition. However, the Japanese garrison refused to surrender until orders from higher command were received. Meanwhile, Japanese troops began to peacefully surround the harbor area, while the Soviet sailors and Marines, in a similar calm manner, took up their own defensive positions. As Kabanov noted, "An incomprehensible situation arose, neither peace nor war. The enemy had numerical superiority, but he neither fights nor wants to capitulate. The night passed in some suspense." The surreal situation was resolved when Rear Admiral Hori Yegoro and Colonel Tado boarded the frigate EK-3 to meet with Captain Studnitikov on the morning of August 22nd. During their discussions, they attempted to negotiate terms, but the Soviet captain issued a bold threat of an immediate, large-scale airstrike and the initiation of hostilities at the port unless they surrendered unconditionally. While it was probably an empty threat, the Japanese officers signed the surrender agreements nonetheless. The process of surrendering the garrison began that evening and it would continue until August 26th. In total, the Soviets captured more than 7,000 officers and men, along with all of their military equipment. Looking towards the northern parts of the Kurils, Japanese forces on Jamshid finally began to lay down their weapons on the afternoon of August 22nd, as Ginyeko's units spread out to secure the island. Meanwhile, in Manchuria, airborne detachments were also landed at Dairen and Port Arthur to secure these key administrative centers before the Americans could possibly take them. Vanguard units of the 6th Guards Tank Army arrived to reinforce them about 2 days later. Meanwhile, in South Sakhalin, heavy fighting persisted at Futamata despite Miniki's ceasefire agreement on August 22nd. Soviet airstrikes supporting the ground forces, when weather conditions actually allowed it, allowed the Japanese to finally surrender by nightfall of August 23rd. At that same time, Andreev dispatched 3 Marine battalions on a small convoy to capture Otomari. However, a fierce storm forced the flotilla to seek refuge in the port of Honto on the morning of August 24th. Once the storm subsided that evening, the force left a company of Marines to garrison the port and resume their voyage to Otomari, arriving there on the morning of August 25th, just as elements of the 113th Rifle Brigade reached the eastern outskirts of the city. By noon, the 88th Division surrendered and the city was secured. And shortly thereafter, the 214th Tank Brigade arrived at Toyahara to secure South Sakhalin's administrative center. Thus, the South Sakhalin operation concluded with nearly 18,320 Japanese soldiers taken prisoner. But this wouldn't mark the end of operations for General Chermizov's 16th Army. Joseph Stalin pushed for the 87th and the 135th Rifle Brigades, along with 3 Marine battalions, to assemble at Otomari to execute amphibious landings on the southern Kuril Islands, specifically Etorofu, Shikotan, and Kunashiri, as well as the inlets of the Hopamai Group. The failure to include the Kuril Islands in the areas designated for surrender to Soviet forces in Truman's General Order No. 1, originally issued on August 15th, exacerbated Stalin's inherent suspicions regarding American intentions. Consequently, Vasilevsky was instructed to organize landings on the Kurils, ensuring that, similar to Port Arthur, Soviet occupation would manifest physically through boots on the ground. Despite Truman's subsequent correction of the omission, mistrust endured, as did the directive to occupy the islands. However, where Stalin hesitated was concerning Hokkaido. Truman's somewhat abrupt rejection of Stalin's demand for a portion of Hokkaido undoubtedly irritated the Soviet dictator, yet he chose not to take further action. Historians debate over the rationale behind Stalin's retreat here. When viewed within the framework of his stated geostrategic goals of securing the Soviet Union's sea lines of communication in the Pacific, it becomes understandable. Sir Winston Churchill once likened the Soviet Union's challenges in this regard to those of a giant with nostrils pinched. A look at a map reveals that control of the Kurils would significantly alleviate this pressure in the Far East, making their acquisition crucial. Similarly, occupying southern Sakhalin would also allow the Soviet Union to control the northern side of Zaporozhye Strait, which connects the Sea of Japan to the Sea of Okhotsk. The strait's opposite shore is formed by the northern coast of Hokkaido, and possessing this area would undeniably enhance the security of communications, and therefore was highly desirable. However, any unilateral action in this regard would incur a significant and public breach with the Americans, the consequences of which could not be easily predicted. Given that Stalin's claim to the Kurils was firmly based on agreements reached at Yalta, an agreement which Truman had honored, his choice to avoid completely rupturing relations with the United States was motivated by strategic self-interest. And, I mean, let's be honest, you don't want to mess with the only player with nukes at this time. Consequently, Anteyev's flotilla carrying those units departed Otamari on August 27th, reaching the west coast of Itorofu at about 3:15 a.m. on August 28th. The landing, conducted using small boats, went unopposed and was met by the surrender of General Olgaya's 89th Division. The occupation of the other islands was also quite peaceful, with the Soviets securing Kunashiri by September 2nd, Shikotan and the Habomai Inlets by September 5th. The remaining northern Kuril Islands surrendered without any incident, as elements of Gnechko's Kamchatka forces arrived at Peromysho on August 24th, Lekotan and Shiaskotan on August 25th, Matsuya on August 26th, Shimeshuru on August 27th, and Urupu by August 29th. In total, 63,840 prisoners were taken throughout the Kurils. On August 24th, air-landed detachments arrived at the cities of Pyongyang and Kangge to secure the last administrative centers in North Korea. 2 days later, units of the 25th Army reached Gansan. With this move, albeit with some geographical liberties, Chitsiukov asserted that the troops of the 25th Army, on the orders of Marshal Mertzkov, reached the 38th parallel. In the days that followed, units of General Kishibuchi's 34th Army would gradually begin to surrender. Finally, in Manchuria, most of Yamato's units had surrendered and they were being disarmed. However, one unit continued to resist until the end of the month. The bypassed and encircled 107th Division was engaged in some fierce fighting for survival against the 94th Rifle Corps. Due to some lack of communication with the Kwangtung Army headquarters, they did not receive any ceasefire orders. As a result, a staff officer from General Aida's 30th Army was dispatched by plane to locate the division and deliver the ceasefire orders. The 107th Division was found near Tailai, and the plane made a forced landing between the Japanese troops and the opposing Soviet forces. The staff officer successfully delivered the orders terminating hostilities in that sector on August 30th, which the Japanese troops promptly complied with. By September 1st, units of the 53rd Army occupied Kailu, Chaoyang, Fuxin, and Goshan-Beizifu, while 4 detachments secured the Qingzhou area on the Liaodong Peninsula. This would mark the conclusion of the Manchurian campaign, with the Soviets claiming to have captured between 594,000 and 609,000 prisoners of war across Inner Mongolia, Manchuria, and North Korea. The captured Japanese military personnel were subjected to forced labor in Siberian internment camps, also known as gulags, as well as camps in Sakhalin, Manchuria, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Mongolia. A significant number were assigned to the construction of the Baikal-Amur main line. Unfortunately, the treatment of prisoners of war was deemed inhumane and mishandled. Many suffered from malnutrition, overwork, cave-ins, floods, unsanitary working conditions, leading to epidemics, very harsh winter conditions, violent guards, and brutal suppression of even the most mild of resistance. Disturbingly, some Japanese prisoners were even lynched by their own fellow captives. Estimates suggest that between 60,000 and 347,000 Japanese died in captivity. Although 18,616 prisoners were released in 1946, the process of repatriating prisoners of war extended well into the 1950s. Those who remained after 1950 were detained for various convictions. However, the releases began in 1953 under different amnesties. Following the death of Joseph Stalin and the subsequent Khrushchev thaw, as it became known, the Soviet attitude towards the remaining Japanese prisoners shifted significantly. Accompanied by Soviet officials, they were taken on tours of cities and allowed to purchase gifts for their families. Before repatriation, a banquet at Khabarovsk hosted by Nikolai Gagarin included high-ranking prisoners such as Jun Ishiroku as attendees. The last major group of 1,025 Japanese POWs were released on December the 23rd of 1956. After that, some Japanese POWs were released in smaller groups, with some only returning in the 1990s following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Interestingly, some prisoners who had been held for decades, many of whom had actually married and started families during their captivity, chose not to return permanently to Japan. The Soviets committed numerous war crimes during their invasion and occupation of Manchuria and other Japanese territories. During the invasion, Soviet soldiers killed and raped Japanese civilians and looted civilian property. As you can imagine, following the Soviet invasion of Manchuria on August 9th of 1945, a large number of Japanese citizens residing in the region sought to repatriate themselves back to Japan. The Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers supervised this mass movement, and in October of 1945 delegated responsibility to Japan's Ministry of Health and Welfare. The Kwangtung Army, which was meant to protect the Japanese settlers in Manchuria, quickly retreated and had abandoned them. With most able-bodied men drafted into the army, the majority of those left behind were women, children, and the elderly, rendering them highly vulnerable to attacks from Soviet soldiers and local Chinese seeking revenge. In Soviet-occupied Manchuria and North Korea, the repatriation of Japanese civilians was characterized by violent expulsions, accompanied by widespread looting, mass killings, and rapid sexual violence perpetrated by both Soviet soldiers and local populations seeking retribution. Many Japanese civilians succumbed to starvation, disease, mass killings, and mass suicide. Approximately 223,000 Japanese civilians residing in the Soviet-occupied zones died, most within a year and a half after August 9th of 1945. Regarding the extensive rape of Japanese women and girls by Soviet soldiers, a former Japanese soldier, Wakatsuki Yoshio, detailed this grim experience in his memoir. What word can possibly describe the violence committed by the Soviet soldiers on Japanese women? I can only think of the word hideous. The victim could be a girl of 12 or 13 years old, or an old lady almost 70 years old. These soldiers did not choose the sites where they raped them, in public, in broad daylight, even on snow-covered roads. The Soviet invasion of Manchuria in 1945 left many Japanese women stranded after their male family members were either conscripted or killed. These women, including young girls, endured severe hardships, facing gang rapes by Soviet soldiers and local Chinese militia groups. In a desperate effort to survive, many were forced to marry Chinese men, either out of necessity or in exchange for assistance in repatriating their remaining family members. Disturbingly, some victims were as young as 13. Some women were held in groups and subjected to repeated sexual violence over extended periods of time. In certain instances, to ensure the safety of the group, members of the Japanese community offered women to the perpetrators. There were also reports of women voluntarily submitting themselves to protect their families, younger peers, or others in their community. After Japan's defeat in 1945, leaders of the Kurakawa settler group in Manchuria offered approximately 15 young women, aged 17 to 21, to Soviet soldiers in exchange for protection. This tragic practice continued from September to November of 1945, with some of the women later being offered to Chinese soldiers as well. With no protection from Japanese soldiers, Japanese women often had to devise unique strategies to avoid rape. Memoirs from female repatriates detail various escape tactics. Some women hid in their attics, narrowly avoiding capture or even gunfire. Others managed to trap intruders in rooms before fleeing or bribing Soviet soldiers with valuables, such as wristwatches, to secure their escape. Notably, some women, particularly former geisha and bar workers, voluntarily went with Soviet soldiers to protect others. These women were referred to as tokutai for their self-sacrifice. Additionally, it wasn't just Japanese women who suffered. Korean and Chinese women were also victims of sexual violence at the hands of various perpetrators in Manchuria. British and American reports indicate that the Soviet Red Army troops looted and terrorized the local population in Shenyang. A foreign witness described how Soviet troops formerly stationed in Berlin were permitted by the Soviet military to enter Shenyang for 3 days of rape and pillage. In Harbin, Soviet forces ignored protests from leaders of the Chinese Communist Party regarding the widespread mass rape and looting committed by their troops. In the immediate aftermath of the war in 1945, in areas of Manchuria occupied by the National Revolutionary Army, 176 Koreans were killed, 1,866 were injured, 3,468 were detained, and 320 were raped by armed Chinese mobs. The attacks against Korean residents in Manchuria were believed to stem from a perception of Korean collaboration with the Japanese colonial rule. Now, one of the most infamous instances of horror was found in the Gigimao massacre. On August 10th and 11th, Xingan was bombed, nearly destroying its urban functions. It was estimated that 3,000 of its 4,000 civilians, anticipating the Soviet invasion, had prepared an evacuation plan. They divided themselves into 3 groups based on residential areas and workplace. The Kwangtung Army, however, failed to inform the General Office officials about the retreat. As a result, residents in the eastern area, many of whom were self-employed or office workers, had difficulty obtaining information and securing transportation, while those in the western area had military personnel who were first to learn of the situation. Some of the civilians, with a handful of armed men, had proceeded on foot towards Gingimao, about 35 kilometers southeast of Xingan Street, to wait for a train at Gingimao Station. Then hopefully they would evacuate to Baichengzi. They aimed to receive protection from the Kwangtung Army at Baichengzi. At around 11:40 a.m. on August 14th, in the vicinity of the Gingimao Hill, where a Lammas temple was located, they encountered an infantry unit consisting of about 14 Soviet medium tanks and 20 trucks. The column reportedly stretched for about 2 kilometers, with about 100 survivors amongst them. Soviet troops launched an attack from the hilltop, deploying tanks with machine gun fire. The tanks attacked multiple times, and when they ceased, Soviet soldiers disembarked and ruthlessly shot and bayoneted the survivors. Many who escaped death from the gunfire were still severely injured or witnessed family members being killed. Some were left holding their loved ones or chose to commit suicide. It is estimated that only about 100 survivors were later confirmed, including nearly 200 school children from the Xingan Street Zaima National School. Kwangtung Army units, which were supposed to escort the civilians and counterattack, had already retreated southwards. Even after the Soviet soldiers left, sporadic gunfire continued, presumably due to suicides. Local residents began to plunder the bodies, stripping them of clothes and valuables. Others drowned in the river while attempting to escape. Reports tell of one woman who had her child killed by Soviet soldiers, only to later face an attack from Chinese militia, who stripped her of her clothes and mutilated her. Surviving mothers and children were also attacked, and those separated were often taken by the Chinese. At the time, it was common for Japanese boys to be sold for 300 yen and girls for 500 yen. Some survivors gathered together and they began committing mass suicide, killing those who wished to end their lives. Others expressed intentions to form death squads with rifles for revenge, but they ultimately did not resist. After the war had ended, on August 15th, attacks continued. A 12-year-old girl who joined a group of 10 women after the incident reported that they were attacked and robbed, taking over a week to reach Zhenxi Station, 10 kilometers from Gingimao. The women sought shelter in an abandoned house near the station, but they were discovered by Soviet soldiers that night who assaulted them until midnight. Afterwards, the soldiers piled dry grass onto the house and set it ablaze in an attempt to burn the women alive. The girl and her sister managed to escape through a window, but many others could not flee in time due to the fire's rapid spread. The girl was forced to live as a residual orphan afterwards. Fortunately, some Chinese, Mongolians, and Koreans provided food for the survivors, with some Chinese showing kindness towards the children. Those orphan children whose parents had been killed became known as residual orphans. There were about 30 in all. Many women were forced to become residual women as well. Tragically, around 200 students from the local school, including the headmaster and his wife, were killed during the chaos. Some historians believe the attack stemmed from the Soviet soldiers mistaking the refugees for armed Japanese troops because men within the group were carrying firearms for protection. But in general, displaced persons at this time often carried small weapons like rifles, and some groups were even armed with light machine guns. In such pioneer groups, women sometimes participated in fighting against bandits. Children above the 5th grade were also forced into combat. There may have also been prior skirmishes with other Japanese civilian groups before the war's end, further complicating the situation as the Soviet army, which included female soldiers, may have regarded these mixed civilian and armed groups as a threat. According to the Soviet military combat records dated August 14th, the Soviet 17th Guards Rifle Division, 19th Guards Rifle Division, 91st Guards Rifle Division, and the 61st Tank Division were stationed northwest of the Gansu Temple, but there was no combat activity in the area reported. On the 15th, this unit advanced towards Baichengzi and occupied Baichengzi Station, which was then taken over by tanks from the 61st Tank Division. Despite extensive documentation, nothing about this incident was revealed until 2014 during the process of perestroika. Reports from British and American sources indicate that 700,000 Soviet troops occupying Manchuria also terrorized and looted the local population in Mukden. They were not deterred by Soviet authorities and engaged in what was described as 3 days of rape and pillage, with similar atrocities occurring in Harbin and across the country. Amidst the mass repatriation of Japanese civilians living in the region, Japanese women in Manchuria faced repeated sexual violence at the hands of Russian soldiers every single day. This was quite similar in North Korea, where both Japanese and Korean women were raped. Additionally, Soviet soldiers looted the property of Japanese, Chinese, Koreans, and just about anybody they could in Manchuria and in North Korea. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. If you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/PacificWarChannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Amidst the chaotic surrenders, Emperor Hirohito accepted defeat, but the Soviet advances continued relentlessly. As they pushed deeper, the Soviets captured key cities, including Harbin, while Japanese soldiers and civilians struggled for survival. War crimes committed by the Soviet troops added to the tragedy, with rapid violence against Japanese civilians. Amidst political tensions, the Soviets secured territory, culminating in the surrender of the remaining Japanese forces. It was a grim conclusion to a campaign marked by a profound shift in the power dynamics of East Asia.